every crime is a wound on the world. We're here to dissect it, layer by layer, to find the truth buried within. This is Anatomy of Crime. The air inside an ice rink has a unique quality. It's a manufactured cold, sharp and sterile, smelling of ozone from the Zamboni and the faint metallic scent of sharpened steel. It is a sealed environment, an artificial world where the laws of physics are gracefully defied. For the athletes who call this world home, it is a place of monastic devotion. It's a life of pre-dawn alarms, of muscles aching in the frigid air, of falling and rising over and over, until the body is a finely tuned instrument of repetition and will. The pain is constant. The sacrifices are immense. All of it is dedicated to creating an illusion. 2.5 minutes of effortless beauty, a fleeting performance where the years of grueling, solitary labor are meant to become invisible. Figure skating is a world built on the facade of perfection. Every smile is practiced. Every sequin is placed. Every landing is a triumph over gravity and doubt. It is a sport where the slightest flaw, a wobble, a misplaced hand, a moment of hesitation, can dissolve a lifetime of work into a handful of disappointing scores. On January 6, 1994, at the Cobo Arena in Detroit, that facade was not just cracked. It was shattered by a sound that had no place there. It was not the sound of a blade catching an edge, or the polite applause of a practice session audience. It was the sound of a guttural scream, a cry of pure agony and confusion, echoing down a featureless cement corridor. It was the sound of Nancy Kerrigan, one of America's premier figure skaters and a favorite for Olympic gold, crumpled on the floor, clutching her right knee and wailing a question to the universe. Why? Why me? In that moment, a crime had been committed that was as clumsy and brutal as the sport it targeted, was elegant and refined. A man had rushed her after her practice, struck her just above the knee with a blunt object, and vanished, leaving behind a world-class athlete writhing in pain, her Olympic dreams seemingly destroyed. The investigation that followed would uncover a plot so bizarre, so ineptly planned and executed, it felt more like a dark Coen brothers comedy than a serious criminal enterprise. It was a conspiracy, born not in the shadowy underworld of organized crime, but in the mundane, desperate world of strip malls and suburban homes in Portland, Oregon. It involved an abusive ex-husband, a delusional fantasist who styled himself as an international spy, and a pair of hapless thugs for hire. And at its center, shrouded in denial and controversy, was Nancy Kerrigan's greatest rival, the powerful, athletic, and perpetually embattled skater from the wrong side of the tracks, Tonya Harding. This case became a global media obsession, a story that transcended sports. It was a perfect ugly storm of class warfare, athletic rivalry, and tabloid justice. Today, on Anatomy of Crime, we dissect the anatomy of a sports conspiracy. We will explore how blinding ambition and a profound sense of grievance can curdle into criminal intent, and how a clumsy plan to disable a rival became one of the most infamous scandals in sports history. To truly understand the why behind the attack on Nancy Kerrigan, you first have to understand the world from which Tonya Harding was forged. She was not a product of the sport's traditional finishing schools, the polished rinks in wealthy suburbs where skating lessons were just another part of a privileged upbringing. She was born in Portland, Oregon, into a life of poverty and profound instability. Her family lived in a series of trailer parks and cheap houses, moving constantly. Her father, Al Harding, worked a string of blue-collar jobs, but was often sidelined by severe asthma. He was a kind but largely powerless figure in Tonya's life. The dominant, gravitational force was her mother, Lavona Golden, A tough, chain-smoking, 5 times married waitress, Livona was by all accounts, including Tonya's, a relentlessly harsh and psychologically abusive parent. She saw a flicker of raw talent when Tonya first stepped on the ice at age 3, and decided, with single-minded ferocity, that skating would be Tonya's ticket out of the life they were living. Livona's methods were brutal. Tonya alleges that her mother threw a steak knife at her, that she beat her with a hairbrush, and that she frequently belittled her, both in private and in public. Livona has admitted to hitting Tonya, defending her actions as necessary discipline to forge a champion. On the ice, Livona was a constant critical presence, a small bird-like woman screaming at Tonya from the boards during practices. She was infamous among the other skating parents. While they wore expensive coats, Livona would sit in the cold rink wearing a fur coat made from rabbit pelts Al Harding had hunted and she had sewn together herself. She was as much an outsider as her daughter. Livona sewed Tonya's costumes by hand, often out of cheap, garish materials that made her stand out from the other girls in their expensive, professionally designed outfits. This became a visual metaphor for Tonya's entire career. She simply did not fit. While other skaters were enrolled in ballet to learn grace and artistry, Tonya's family couldn't afford it. She was pure, explosive power. She was a phenomenal athlete, short, muscular, and aggressive on the ice. Her jumps were higher and faster than anyone else's. She became the first American woman, and only the second in history, to land the treacherous triple axel in competition. The triple axel is a breathtakingly difficult jump, requiring 3.5 rotations in the air. Launched from a forward-facing edge, it is a feat of timing, power, and courage that few have mastered. For a brief moment, in 1991, that jump made Tonya Harding the best figure skater in the world. She won the U.S. championships, and it seemed as though her raw talent would finally force the establishment to accept her. But in the subjective world of figure skating judging, athleticism was only part of the equation. The sport prized a certain aesthetic, what was called the total package. This was a coded term for a specific kind of presentation, graceful, artistic, and embodying a demure, traditional femininity. Tonya, with her powerful thighs, her strained smile, her rock and roll music choices like ZZ Top, and her homemade costumes, was the antithesis of this ideal. She felt, and often was, punished by the judges in the artistic impression scores for not being the ice princess they wanted. She was the rough-edged brawler in a world of ballerinas, and no matter how high she jumped, she could never quite overcome the class-based biases of the sport's gatekeepers. This constant struggle, this feeling of being an outsider who had to fight twice as hard for half the recognition, bred in her a deep and abiding resentment. It was a chip on her shoulder that would come to define her entire public persona. Nancy Kerrigan, in the eyes of the public and the media, was everything Tonya Harding was not. She was tall, elegant, and possessed a classic lyrical style that judges adored. Born in Stoneham, Massachusetts, a working-class suburb of Boston, her background was not one of immense wealth, but it was portrayed as wholesome and stable. Her father, Daniel Kerrigan, was a welder who often worked 3 jobs to fund her skating career, driving the Zamboni at the local rink in exchange for ice time. Her mother, Brenda, became legally blind from a young age, and the image of Nancy guiding her mother through crowds became a symbol of her gentle character. The Kerrigan family narrative was one of idyllic blue-collar dedication. They were presented as the ideal skating family, sacrificing everything for their deserving daughter's dream. This image, while not untrue, was carefully curated. Nancy's own working-class roots were often downplayed in favor of a more marketable princess persona. She secured major corporate sponsorships with companies like Campbell's Soup, Revlon, Reebok, and Seiko. She wore costumes designed by the famed Vera Wang. The media cast her as America's sweetheart, the graceful heir apparent destined for glory. This narrative, however, masked a fierce competitor. Kerrigan was not a fragile doll. She was a disciplined, powerful athlete in her own right, with a steely determination that belied her elegant exterior. The media, however, had little room for such nuance. In the lead-up to 1994, the story was simplified into a compelling duo of archetypes. Nancy was the graceful princess, and Tonya was the gritty outcast. This dynamic set the stage for one of the most compelling rivalries in American sports. They were the two dominant forces in U.S. women's figure skating, constantly trading victories. Harding had her incredible triple axel, but her performances were often inconsistent. Kerrigan lacked Harding's signature power move, but was a far more consistent and artistically polished performer, earning her a bronze medal at the 1992 Winter Olympics. As the 1994 Olympic season began, the stakes were higher than ever. But Tonya's career was on a downward trajectory. After her peak in 1991, her skating had become erratic. She had developed competition asthma, suffered from injuries, and had failed to land the triple axel cleanly in competition for nearly 2 years. The 1994 U.S. Championships in Detroit were her last best chance to prove she still belonged on the Olympic team. For Tonya, it felt like everything was on the line. And in her corner, a toxic and controlling presence, was the man who would become the catalyst for the entire disaster, her ex-husband, Jeff Gillooly. Tonya Harding and Jeff Gillooly had a relationship that could best be described as a five-alarm fire. They met when she was just 15 and he was 17, and they married in 1990. Their life together was a chaotic cycle of intense passion, bitter breakups, and violent reconciliations. Harding filed for divorce twice and sought restraining orders against Gillooly, citing numerous instances of physical abuse. In one filing, she alleged he had wrenched her arm and pulled her hair. In another, that he had threatened her with a gun. Yet, they always seemed to find their way back to each other. By late 1993, they were living together again in a rented house in Beaver Creek, Oregon, with Gillooly acting as her de facto manager and biggest supporter, a seemingly inseparable part of her chaotic orbit. He was deeply invested in her success, not just emotionally, but financially. An Olympic medal for Tonya meant endorsement deals and a secure future for them both. It was within this pressure cooker environment of desperation and codependency that the seed of the conspiracy was planted, and the person who would nurture that seed into a monstrous half-baked plan was a man named Sean Eckert. Eckert was a friend of Gillooly's and had appointed himself Tonya's bodyguard. He was, to put it mildly, a deeply strange individual. At 26 years old, he weighed over 300 pounds, lived with his parents, and possessed a grandiose sense of self-importance utterly disconnected from reality. He told people he was an expert in international espionage and counter-terrorism, a Swiss-educated covert operative with a global network of contacts. He claimed his firm, World Bodyguard Services, handled security for wealthy clients across the globe. In reality, his entire professional life was a fantasy. He had a high school education, and his expertise came from reading spy novels and watching action movies. He was a classic fantasist, a man whose entire personality was a poorly constructed fiction. According to Jeff Gillooly's later confessions, the initial idea was not to physically harm Nancy Kerrigan. It was to disrupt her. In the fall of 1993, with Tonya struggling to land her jumps and her confidence shattered, Gillooly and Eckert began discussing ways to rattle her main rival. Their first idea was to send anonymous death threats to Kerrigan, hoping to psychologically sabotage her before the U.S. Championships. According to Gillooly, they discussed this plan with Tonya at a meeting in late December 1993. Tonya has always maintained that this was the extent of her knowledge. She claims she found out about the threatening letter idea, thought it was stupid, and demanded they call it off. She insists she knew nothing more. Gillooly's version of events is starkly different. He claimed that Tonya was frustrated that the plan wasn't enough, and that in that meeting she asked, "What else?" He alleged that it was then that the conversation escalated to taking Kerrigan out of competition entirely. He has always maintained that Tonya knew about and approved of the escalating plan, stating in a meeting, "Okay, let's do it." This conflicting testimony sits at the dark heart of the case, the central, he said, she said, that has never been definitively resolved. Whether Tonya knew or not, it was Sean Eckert, the Walter Mitty of bodyguarding, who took the idea and ran with it. He transformed the concept from psychological warfare into physical assault. He convinced the impressionable and desperate Gillooly that for a few $1,000s he could use his connections to hire someone to take Kerrigan out of the competition. The goal, they decided, was not to permanently injure her, but to strike her on the landing leg with enough force to cause a severe deep-tissue bruise, forcing her to withdraw from the national championships. This would guarantee Tonya a spot on the Olympic team. It was a brutish, desperate gambit. Gillooly, seeing Tonya's chances fade, provided the money, around $6,500 in total. Eckert, a man whose network of international spies was entirely imaginary, did what any real-life mastermind would do. He called a buddy from his home state of Arizona. That buddy was Derek Smith, a 29-year-old drifter and acquaintance from a self-defense class. Smith was a man with a thin criminal record and a pressing need for money. He, in turn, recruited his nephew, 22-year-old Shane Stant, to be the actual hitman. Stant was a muscular but aimless young man who saw the job as an easy payday. The team of conspirators was now complete. A desperate ex-husband, a delusional bodyguard, and 2 amateur thugs. This was a crew whose stunning incompetence would be their immediate undoing. Their first attempt to carry out the attack was a catalogue of errors. Stant and Smith flew to Massachusetts, Kerrigan's home state, intending to assault her at her practice rink in Cape Cod. But they were a comedy of errors. They arrived to find the rink was closed. They drove around aimlessly, unable to find her. They got confused, lost, and frustrated. After days of bumbling around Massachusetts, they gave up. A more sensible group might have taken this as a sign to abort the mission. But for them, it was merely a logistical setback. Eckert and Gillooly, back in Oregon, were furious at the failure. They instructed Stant and Smith to try again at the national championships in Detroit. The plan was still on. On January 6, 1994, the plan, such as it was, finally lurched into motion. Shane Stant arrived at Cobo Arena in Detroit. He purchased a ticket to the practice session. Casing the layout of the arena, he identified a long, featureless corridor that Nancy Kerrigan would use to walk from the ice to the locker room. It was a relatively secluded area, shielded from the main arena by a series of curtains. He armed himself with a 21-inch ASP tactical baton, a collapsible steel weapon designed to inflict maximum pain and deep tissue damage without necessarily breaking a bone. His instructions were clear. Hit her on the right leg, her landing leg, hard enough to knock her out of the competition. After her practice session, Nancy Kerrigan stepped off the ice, radiant and confident. She was the reigning national champion and had just completed a flawless run-through of her program. She was smiling, talking to reporters, her breath misting in the cold arena air. She walked down the corridor and paused to speak with a television crew for a brief interview. As she turned to continue towards the locker room, Stant made his move. He emerged quickly from behind a blue curtain, holding the baton in both hands. He raised it and brought it down with full force on the back of Kerrigan's right thigh, just above the knee. The sound of the impact was sickeningly dull. Kerrigan let out a piercing scream and collapsed. Stant, his job done, turned and fled. He ran through the arena, found the nearest exit, and shattered a glass door with the baton to make his escape, disappearing into the Detroit afternoon. The chaos that erupted in that hallway was immediate and absolute. Reporters, coaches, and officials rushed to Kerrigan's side. She was on the floor, cradling her leg, her face a mask of pain and shock. A camera crew, which had been interviewing her just moments before, captured the raw, visceral aftermath. Her father, Daniel, rushed to her side, eventually lifting her into his arms and carrying her into the locker room. The now iconic footage of a sobbing Kerrigan wailing, "Why, why, why?" was broadcast on news channels across the globe within hours. The question she screamed was the same one on everyone's mind. Who would do this, and why? Initially, the speculation was rampant. Was it a crazed fan, a random act of violence? But almost immediately, suspicion, unspoken at first, began to drift toward the rivalry that had defined the sport for the past 2 years. The attack was too specific, too targeted. The assailant hadn't stolen anything. Their only goal was to injure Nancy Kerrigan's leg. The logic was inescapable. The only person who stood to benefit directly from Kerrigan's withdrawal was her primary competitor, Tonya Harding. The following day, with Kerrigan forced to withdraw due to her injuries, severe bruising and swelling, but miraculously no broken bones, Tonya Harding skated her way to the U.S. national title. Her victory secured her a place on the Olympic team alongside the injured Kerrigan, who was granted the second spot by the U.S. Figure Skating Association. The stage was now set for a showdown in Lillehammer, but the real drama was just beginning to unfold back in Portland. A well-executed conspiracy relies on discipline, secrecy, and intelligence. The plot against Nancy Kerrigan had none of these things. Its undoing began almost immediately, and it started with the weakest link, Sean Eckert. The delusional bodyguard simply could not keep his mouth shut. He saw himself as the mastermind of a brilliant operation and felt the need to brag about it. He told a friend from a college criminal justice class, a minister in training named Eugene Gooley, all about the plan. He played Gooley a tape recording of a meeting he'd had with Gillooly and Derek Smith, a tape he had ridiculously made as a form of insurance. Gooley, horrified by what he was hearing, went to the authorities. Simultaneously, a freelance journalist in Portland named Vera Morano received an anonymous tip. The caller pointed her toward Sean Eckert, suggesting he knew something about the attack. Morano began digging. She discovered Eckert's boasts about being a security expert and his connections to Harding and Gillooly. The pieces were starting to fall into place. The FBI, now armed with Gooley's information and Morano's reporting, opened a full-scale investigation. The conspirators, meanwhile, were beginning to panic. They had left a clumsy, obvious trail. Shane Stant had used his real name and credit card to book his flights and hotel. Derek Smith, the getaway driver, had left a paper trail a mile wide. The handwritten notes from one of their planning sessions, detailing their expenses, were found in a dumpster behind a local restaurant by a chef. On January 12, less than a week after the attack, the FBI brought Sean Eckert in for questioning. His carefully constructed fantasy world crumbled under the pressure of a federal investigation. After initially denying everything, he confessed. For 2 hours, he laid out the entire plot, implicating Gillooly, Smith, and Stant. He also implicated Tonya Harding, claiming she had been aware of the plan from an early stage and had helped cover it up. Based on his confession, the FBI swiftly arrested Smith and Stant. The net was closing. Jeff Gillooly initially denied everything. He and Tonya held a press conference at their lawyer's office, projecting an image of shocked innocence. But the evidence was mounting. The FBI had Eckert's testimony, the paper trail, and most damningly, the audio tapes. On January 19th, Jeff Gillooly surrendered to the FBI. Facing a long prison sentence, he cut a deal. In exchange for a reduced sentence, he agreed to plead guilty and testify against everyone else involved, including his ex-wife. His confession was a bombshell. He confirmed the entire plot and corroborated Eckert's claim. He insisted Tonya Harding knew about the plan to injure Kerrigan, had approved it, and had actively participated in the cover-up after the fact. The world was now transfixed. A bizarre crime had escalated into a national soap opera. Tonya Harding was no longer just an athlete. She was the central figure in a federal criminal investigation. She was questioned by the FBI for over 10 hours on January 18th. She admitted that she had figured out the men's involvement after the attack, but had failed to report it to the authorities. This in itself was a crime, misprision of a felony, but she adamantly denied any prior knowledge of the plot to harm Kerrigan. She painted herself as a victim of Gillooly's abuse and manipulation, a woman who was too scared and too confused to do the right thing once she learned the truth. The public was divided. Was she a cold, calculating conspirator? Or was she a terrified, abused woman caught in a web, spun by the foolish, dangerous men around her? While the legal storm raged in the United States, an even greater media circus was brewing across the Atlantic. The 1994 Winter Olympics in Lillehammer, Norway, were about to begin, and against all odds, both Tonya Harding and Nancy Kerrigan were on the U.S. team. Harding's spot was precarious. The United States Olympic Committee and the U.S. Figure Skating Association moved to disqualify her, arguing that her conduct had violated their code of ethics. But Harding's lawyers fought back, threatening a $25 million lawsuit that would disrupt the games. Reluctantly, the committees backed down. Tonya Harding would be allowed to skate. The scene in Lillehammer was surreal. It was less an athletic competition and more a global media event, the likes of which had never been seen before. Over 700 journalists, many of whom had never covered a sporting event in their lives, descended on the small Norwegian town. The women's figure skating competition became the hottest ticket in the world. The two American teammates, the victim and the accused, were forced to navigate a bizarre and tense reality. They practiced on the same ice, often just feet apart, surrounded by a phalanx of cameras capturing every glance, every awkward turn. They passed each other in the hallways of the Olympic Village, a silent Cold War playing out under the watchful eye of the entire planet. The first practice session they shared was a media event of absurd proportions, with reporters standing 10 deep around the rink. Nancy Kerrigan, for her part, handled the immense pressure with remarkable composure. She had recovered physically from the attack and was skating well. She seemed determined to not let the scandal define her. She focused on her performance, trying to block out the noise. Harding, however, seemed to be unraveling. The weight of the investigation, the global scrutiny, and her own uncertain future appeared to be crushing her. She was emotional and erratic in her practices. The climax of the drama came during the ladies' free skate competition on February 25th. It became one of the most watched television broadcasts in American history, with ratings that rivaled the Super Bowl. Nancy Kerrigan skated a beautiful, poignant program. It wasn't perfect. She slightly two-footed a couple of landings, but it was a performance of immense grace under pressure. She sat in first place, an Olympic medal within her grasp. Then it was Tonya's turn. Her time on the ice was a spectacle of pure chaos. She took the ice late, and just seconds into her program, she aborted a jump and skated over to the judges' stand in tears. She was having a problem with her skate lace. The judges, following the rules, granted her a rare duver, and she went backstage for a frantic repair. Many were skeptical, seeing it as a desperate ploy. When she returned to the ice, her concentration was shattered. Her performance was lackluster, a shadow of her former power. She finished in a distant 8th place. The dream was over. Nancy Kerrigan would go on to win the silver medal, narrowly losing the gold to Ukraine's Oksana Baiul in a controversial 54 split decision. But in the eyes of many, her silver was a victory of spirit and resilience. With the Olympic flame extinguished, the final act of the legal drama played out back in the United States. Shane Stant, Derek Smith, and Sean Eckert all pleaded guilty and received prison sentences for their roles in the conspiracy. Jeff Gillooly also pleaded guilty to racketeering and was sentenced to 2 years in prison. The last remaining piece was Tonya Harding. Facing a mountain of evidence that she had, at the very least, helped cover up the crime, she sought to avoid a trial and potential jail time. On March 16, 1994, Tonya Harding walked into a Portland courtroom and accepted a plea bargain. She pleaded guilty to a single felony count of conspiracy to hinder prosecution. She admitted in court that she had learned of the plot after it happened and had failed to notify authorities, lying to federal investigators to protect the men involved. By pleading guilty, she avoided prison time. Her sentence included 3 years of probation, 500 hours of community service, and a $160,000 fine. But the most significant punishment was yet to come. As part of her plea agreement, she was required to resign from the U.S. Figure Skating Association. The final crushing blow came on June 30, 1994. Following their own 5-month investigation, the U.S. Figure Skating Association held a disciplinary hearing. Their standard of proof was a preponderance of the evidence, a lower bar than the beyond a reasonable doubt required in criminal court. They concluded that Harding had possessed prior knowledge of the attack and had demonstrated a clear disregard for fairness, good sportsmanship, and ethical behavior. The panel's report stated that she knew of the conspiracy and approved of the plan's general outline. They stripped her of her 1994 national championship title and banned her from the association for life. This meant she could never compete in a sanctioned event or even coach ever again. Her career, for which she had sacrificed her childhood and her body, was officially and irrevocably over. The anatomy of this conspiracy is not one of masterful planning or criminal genius. It is the anatomy of desperation. It was a brutish, simple-minded plot hatched by foolish men, a physical manifestation of the resentment that had simmered within Tonya Harding's camp for years. The weapon they chose, a blunt baton, was as unsubtle and crude as the worldview that drove them. They saw the figure skating world as a rigged game, an exclusive club where the elegant Nancy Kerrigan was the chosen one, and the powerful Tonya Harding was the perpetual outsider. They couldn't beat the system with grace or artistry, so they decided to attack it with a piece of steel in a dark hallway. The plan was a perfect mirror of their perceived predicament. If you can't win by their rules, break their rules and their legs. The conspiracy was also an anatomy of delusion, personified by Sean Eckert. His grandiose fantasies of being a spy transformed a malicious but vague idea into a concrete, actionable crime. He lent the plot a veneer of professionalism that it in no way deserved, convincing Gillooly that this was a viable, controllable operation. But it was all a fantasy, and when the slightest pressure was applied by real investigators, the entire fiction collapsed, taking everyone down with it. The trail of evidence they left was not that of seasoned criminals, but of amateurs who believed their own hype, blind to the obvious consequences of their actions. And ultimately, the enduring legacy of this case is shaped by the anatomy of a media frenzy. The story of Tonya and Nancy was a ready-made narrative that the burgeoning 24-hour news cycle seized upon with ravenous intensity. It was good versus evil, the princess versus the pauper, the graceful victim versus the snarling villain. This simplistic binary framing ignored the complexities of both women. It overlooked Nancy Kerrigan's own working-class roots and steely resolve, and it flattened Tonya Harding's story, ignoring the documented abuse and the legitimate class biases she faced in her sport. The scandal became a cultural phenomenon, a morality play for a national audience, with a verdict delivered not just in a courtroom, but on the nightly news and in the pages of tabloids. It cemented the images of these two athletes in the public imagination, trapping them in the roles they were assigned in the winter of 1994. The attack on Nancy Kerrigan was a crime that left a permanent scar on a sport built on the illusion of perfection. It revealed a dark undercurrent of desperation and violence, hiding just beneath the sparkling, pristine surface of the ice. The plot failed in its ultimate goal. Nancy Kerrigan recovered, competed, and won an Olympic medal. But the conspiracy succeeded in destroying Tonya Harding's career, making her a pariah in the only world she had ever known. The echoes of that scream in the Detroit hallway reverberate to this day, a chilling reminder that the line between fierce ambition and criminal intent can be as thin and as fragile as a blade's edge. This has been Anatomy of Crime, where the truth is never simple, but always worth seeking.